is Will Engel. I am with the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology. I have also been a member of the Open UBC Planning Committee. This event is being recorded and live streamed. The camera will only be focused on the speaker. But if you do ask a question, that will be recorded. So be aware of that. And we'll just wait a minute or two, and then I'll introduce Paul. That's quiet, so maybe we'll...
Yeah, go ahead anytime.
So I'm really excited for this morning's opening presentation. I'm very, I would say in a way, humbled to introduce Paul, who is a senior project manager at Creative Commons and is speaking on a lot of topics that are very important to the work I do and the interests I have. So Paul today is going to be speaking about the intersection of open educational practices and the free culture community. And he's really going to be talking about how open education practices are already affecting the university's core missions of teaching and learning, but also research, data, and community. So with that, I think I'll just let you start.
Thanks, Bob. Is this mic on for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, so thanks for inviting me. I was here last year. It feels great to always come back to UBC and to provide some insight into the work that I'm now doing at Creative Commons. And today's talk is going to be a little bit different than some of what I've talked about in the past. I've been thinking about the open initiatives across really society. And so I wanted to present today some of the thoughts that I've been thinking about as I look at the work that's taking place around openness in education, but also in culture, in government, and in other areas, and just kind of provoke a little bit of debate, perhaps, about how it's playing out in education and encourage wider adoption. And I do like, so I'll just talk right through this whole thing if you let me, but if you have questions at any time, just shout them out or stick your hand up or ask me to stop, and I'll be happy to answer anything that you want to know. So the way I want to frame this is that one of the things that I get to experience at Creative Commons now, where my colleagues are working not only in education but in libraries and museums, with musicians, with artists, is that this set of openness or these open practices are really starting to be adopted and utilized across many facets of society, including education, and that with open practices come a set of freedoms. And it's this set of freedoms that I think is really one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about these days, and in particular, who uses those freedoms. So as you all, I'm sure know, with the open source software movement, with Richard Stallman's efforts to establish a mechanism for freely sharing software, the whole free software movement got shaped by defining a set of freedoms. So with free software, you have the freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how it works and change it to make it do what you wish, the freedom to redistribute copies, and the freedom to improve that program and release your improvements to the public. I actually have tried rewriting this from an open education point of view, and it's really fun to try to craft and wordsmith it to be a set of freedoms associated with open education. One of the things that Richard Stallman focused on, though, was that this free software was a matter of liberty, not price. So the emphasis was not on freely available on the web at no cost. It was with those four set of freedoms that enabled people to do so much more. And so when I look at a MOOC now, a freely available on the web course, it simply falls quite a bit short from any of the kind of freedoms that we're really talking about here. So think free speech, not free beer. Although this free beer initiative is, I don't know if you've ever checked this out, but there is a published recipe for beer that is openly licensed, and everyone's encouraged to create that beer yourself. And some of the manufacturers of beer have actually used that recipe and created their own free beer recipes that they actually bottle and distribute. I think it's been interesting to notice the transition from free to open. And when you read about this in the software space, it becomes apparent that that was partly a business move. So the social activism, the freedom aspects of the open source software movement, it really didn't appeal to companies, and they also mistakenly assumed that free meant no money. And obviously companies are in the business of making money, and so it ended up being rebranded as open source software to emphasize the business potential of openness and sharing and collaborating on code. And with that, when you look at the actual definition of open source software compared to free software, one of the standout distinctions is that the open source definition shifted from talking about freedoms to expressing a set of conditions that must be met for something to be open. And so when I speak to my colleagues and to all of you about things like openness in education, and certainly open education resources and open access are the two perhaps biggest open initiatives in education at this point in time, I ask myself what freedoms are being accorded with those initiatives. And I also ask myself who is using those freedoms. And so for both open access and open education resources, we're seeing the utilization of either a public domain dedication or open licenses like those of Creative Commons. And this shows you the spectrum of Creative Commons licenses in a kind of perspective showing from least open to most open. And there are a set of freedoms that come with the use of these licenses. So you have typically the freedom to copy and distribute, the freedom to publicly perform, publicly display, the freedom to build upon, and the freedom to distribute or redistribute. So those freedoms that come with the utilization of these licenses on either education content or research articles provide with them a set of freedoms and permissions. I think it's interesting, though, to ask yourself who's making use of those freedoms. It's not enough to have the freedom of speech. It's like who exercises that freedom. And you'll hear from me throughout this talk that, in my view, openness in education currently has been focused on utilization of those freedoms by government, institutions, and faculty, but not students. And the ultimate call for my talk today is to engage students in those freedoms. I just wanted to leave education briefly and look at some of these other ways that openness is playing out in society. So let's look at openness in government. There is an open government partnership happening around the world. The blue countries joined it in 2011, the green in 2012, yellow is 2013, and orange is 2014. And here are the kinds of things that the Open Government Initiative is looking at. They're looking at fiscal openness, open data, legislative openness, access to information, and extractives. And then there you can see to the left all the kinds of things that they're engaged in. So very interesting kind of push among certain governments around the world to be more open and more engaging of their citizenry. So the whole citizen participation piece there on the left, you can see is actually one of the more active aspects of open government. And when you think about how open government, how these kind of practices start to filter down and play out in education, you end up seeing initiatives like this one recently launched by the European Commission called Opening Up Education, which has really been a push on their part to boost innovation and digital skills in schools and universities. As part of that push, what they committed to doing was openly licensing education resources that they fund. And they also pushed for encouraging greater partnerships among creators. So the actual European Commission initiative is looking to partner up teachers with publishers and ICT companies. And they're pushing for new business models around open education, and also released this portal at the bottom to facilitate people finding education resources, sharing education resources, and learning more about it from that context. Actually, a couple of days ago, Wales released their open declaration of intent, and these declarations, I think, have been a running theme throughout openness in education, but this one's quite interesting. Here you have a whole country that has specified in their open declaration that they're going to, again, make all education materials developed with public funds openly available through open licenses. They're going to promote and use OER to widen access to non-traditional students. And the part that I really like was the last 2 points. They're actually going to try to embed openness as a practice within all the universities in Wales. And more importantly, the last bullet point was one of the few open declaration initiatives in education that I've seen that includes students. So here they're actually saying, we're going to push to have students be co-creators of open education materials with universities. I was talking with some of your colleagues here at UBC before this morning's talk, and I know that the whole copyright, intellectual property of who owns course materials is a hot topic at UBC, and it's always revolved around faculty. But the more we encourage and engage students in the actual use and development of open education resources, it's going to need to be broadened to look at who owns the intellectual property and copyright of student-prepared and created content. And it no longer becomes the sole domain of faculty, it becomes a shared domain, a shared responsibility. I think it's really exciting. I think there's a lot of potential, and I will show some of the examples of that potential in some of the other aspects of society in a few minutes. One of the other things that we're seeing is, so from an open declaration to an open policy. So here you have the California Community College Board of Governors voting unanimously to specify that open licensing has to be used on all public materials that they issue a contract or a grant for. And they're one of the largest system providers in California and really the largest in the world now to require a Creative Commons license on publicly funded grant materials. And the basic nub of this policy, it really boils down to a very simple policy, and yet one that we historically have not really thought much about in higher education. And that is public funds, taxpayers' money, is being given to the universities to fund faculty and fund creation of courses and teaching materials. And the basic premise is the public who funded it ought to have access to it. It's especially in the digital age when it becomes essentially zero cost to make something publicly accessible to others. So the basic nub of the policy that many are initiating around the world is that public funds should result in a public good. This is an example that I'm working with currently right now. The U.S. Department of Labor in 2011 actually issued the first of 4 RFPs to all their community colleges in the U.S. And they're going to spend $2 billion over 4 years to incent them to create online learning materials that will take people who've been displaced through things like free trade agreements, who are unemployed or perhaps have low skills, and reskill them into high-growth industry sectors in each of their states, and also reskill them in the sense of advancing their skills so that they can earn higher paid money as a more skilled worker. But again, one of the things the Department of Labor has done is specify that all the courseware that gets created, and in fact really all the materials that get created by the colleges using these funds have to be CC BY licensed or Creative Commons Attribution licensed. And this is going to be really exciting when the actual deliverables start hitting the streets, because the work that these colleges are doing is in unusual areas from an open education perspective. They're in areas like manufacturing and energy and transportation, as opposed to the more traditional mainstream academic areas that has been the focus so far. So one of the things that we're seeing is a change from what has been the current funding cycle for education resources, where you get funding provided by government, education resources produced. They're usually some sort of peer review, but it's very limited, if any, to within the grantee's institution. The copyright rests with the grantee. There's no obligation to share. The content ends up only being used within that institution. The public doesn't know about it, never gets to see it really unless you pay tuition and sign up for a course. And the public's granted little or no reuse rights. Our take on that is that that's a poor return on public investment. And what we're seeing is a more optimized cycle for education resources where, sure, government money is being provided, education resources are produced, but because they're open, there's a broader peer review of the larger education community. The copyright still sits with whoever's developed it, but they agree to openly license it. So the content gets used by others beyond just that grantee and typically beyond just that institution. The public ends up knowing about those education resources. The public is granted full reuse rights. We think this enables accelerated learning and maximizes the return on public investment. And that's the kind of scenario that's being played out with these policy changes, these open declarations, and these initiatives by government and institutions. And it's a similar thing with research. So if you think about higher education, you've got teaching, research, and community. Let's say it's the three pillars of activity within higher education. What we're seeing also is that, and there's lots of material outside the door and here on the tables about open access. But again, traditionally for research, you had government providing funding, scientific research being done by faculty, papers being written, and then those got submitted by faculty to journals and were peer-reviewed. They were accepted, and usually the author transferred copyright to the publishers as a condition of getting it published in the journal. The article got published in a closed journal. The library then has to subscribe to that journal and pay additional public money on a per article basis to view that journal on a publisher's website. And again, the public was granted little or no reuse rights beyond access to read the articles if they went to a library that had paid the subscription fee. And so from our perspective, that's a slow scientific progress. It's poor return on public investment. And we're seeing both here in Canada and the US a real push and move towards more open access where when the articles are submitted to journals for peer review, they not only are peer reviewed, but they get published in either an open access journal or an open repository in a way that they're openly licensed so that others can download them and the public is granted full reuse rights. And this, we think, will result in accelerated scientific progress and optimize the return on public investment. And there's an article actually outside the door in the little table that's been set up about this initiative. So here in Canada, the Canadian Institutes of National Research have had an open access kind of policy, but now it's broadening to include all three of the funding research entities in Canada. So that will also include NSERC and SSHRC. They're looking to essentially have a tri-agency open access policy that would require all of their faculty who accept a research grant from any of these three entities to publish, open access publish their research findings within 12 months. I think these two things, the whole open education resources and open access, are really now firmly established. And open access has really accelerated not only here in Canada, but more particularly in the US and the UK over the last year. There's been a huge amount of activity in that. And I think that both the Open Education Resource Initiative and the Open Access Initiative are really exciting and positive steps around openness and sharing. Again, I always look at them at what freedoms are being provided and who's using those freedoms. And here again, we're seeing these freedoms are really being addressed to faculty, not so much to students. Another aspect that I think is coming, if it hasn't hit here already, is around sharing the data. So when you do your research and you generate all that data, you publish your results, usually the data set is not openly published. And you actually have to request access to the raw data if you want to validate or repeat that experiment. And so now there's a real push to actually not only openly publish your research, but to openly publish your data. And PLOS, among others, is really kind of leading the push for this. And there are now actual vendors starting to provide services for this, such as Figshare. So one of the things that we've been looking at is how policy complements practice. So I talked about open policy and as it being a piece that actually sort of stimulates open practices. And so part of my work with my colleagues at Creative Commons involves creating a policy registry associated with open education resources. So for institutions that are, or organizations that are looking to establish some sort of policy around open education resources, we have over 82 actual policy samples here on our website that could be reviewed from a wording and practice perspective. And we're also just about to launch what we call the Open Policy Network. What's happened is that we've been a recipient of a lot of requests for support from others around the world who want to understand how to frame legislation and policy regarding openness. And so we're actually going to form an open policy network that looks to bring together those decision makers and those people who are involved in legislation to enable them to dialogue with each other and to learn from each other around how to best do that. So, we're seeing open practices being adopted across many facets of society. In the case of education, those freedoms, I'm arguing, are mostly being used by government, institutions, and faculty, but why not students? And I want to just take a minute then to invite you to think about why not students in the context of how openness is playing out in free culture. So just to set the stage here, so in free culture, what we're seeing is a shift from the analog era where you had writers and performers and broadcasters who were the primary cultural producers. The big shift that's happening is that the digital age has placed tools in the hands of all of us to be cultural producers, if you will. So we're all essentially creators of cultural work. And one of the things that's really interesting about the free culture movement is that it really was a hack on the free software movement, and the whole focus of people like Larry Lessig and others was to ensure that end users, people like you and I, could control their own creative process and actively create culture. And this was a shift in the sense that in the past, non-free culture, if you will, was under the control of someone else. And so the whole effort here was on a set of freedoms that would liberate the creative process and give us more control over culture. In a sense, democratizing culture and ensuring that we all have the freedom to participate in creating culture. And we've seen since that, this is really going back 10 years, we've seen a real explosion of individual participation in culture. Flickr for photos, here I'm just, and by the way, really from a free culture point of view, if you're thinking about the Creative Commons licenses, the CC BY and the CC BY SA are the only two licenses that really are considered free, approved for free culture. And when we look at things like Flickr from a photos point of view, the screenshot that I did just the other day there, so there's 51 million photos with just an attribution license on Flickr. Wikipedia's got over 4 million articles in English alone. It's CC BY SA. And YouTube also is now supporting its users with the option to create Creative Commons licensed videos, and there's over 4 million of those on YouTube. So the actual empowerment of end users to participate and create cultural components, whether it be photography, whether it be encyclopedia entries, or whether it be video, has really been adopted and embraced by end users, by individuals. And we've also seen a similar acceptance and in a sense, embracing of this by the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And if you want to, if this is of interest to you, I encourage you to check out GLAM, openglam.org. And they actually publish a set of principles where basically they're saying, look, the galleries and libraries and museums have been the custodians of cultural heritage in their collections. And now they want to make those collections more discoverable, make them available, allow you to see them without necessarily coming onto the facility where the library or archive or museum is. But more importantly, this last statement, so they're saying, look, it's really important that, step one is to openly license your collection, but the real exciting potential is around the openness for collaboration and for novel forms of user engagement. And that's really kind of where the innovation is starting to happen now within the libraries, archives, and museums space, is around that collaboration and form of interaction with the end user. I actually have been reading this book called Open Design, which is really one of the best books I've read about openness in quite a long time. And it talks about what what it refers to as commons-based peer production. So the whole idea of individuals collaborating to produce cultural content, knowledge, and information, and physical goods, and we'll talk about that in a sec, and then sharing the results as products, as methods, and collaborating with others on its kind of enhancement and future use. And their term for this is commons-based peer production, which I really think is quite a much nicer sounding term than, say, crowdsourcing. Because crowdsourcing involves a lot more than just simply people throwing up something. And so the whole notion of a commons-based peer production is something I thought I'd explore just for a minute. I don't know if any of you have actually looked at Hatsune Miku, the world's sort of first crowdsourced or commons-based peer production celebrity. This is a futuristic cartoon character that Krypton Future Media created. It's essentially, this cartoon character was created to accompany a sort of a synthetic voice music software that Krypton had authored. And it allowed end users to essentially make music with this synthetic voice, which was based on the voice of a Japanese actress. And so Krypton, this became very popular, and Krypton actually ended up adopting a Creative Commons CC BY non-commercial license, and over 1 million derivative artworks have been produced of this character, and over 100,000 fan-produced songs, and over 170,000 videos. And this Hatsune actually performs live in places like Hong Kong and LA, where she sings on stage fan-produced songs. She actually looks like she's 3D, but she's actually a 2D projection on a curved glass screen. Actually, let me just see if I can. I actually had this up for a minute, so here, let's just see. You got to see what she looks like. This is a live performance of a cartoon character on stage singing user-produced synthetic voice songs. Okay, that's enough. A very interesting phenomenon and fascinating development in the free culture space. To turn to some less sort of esoteric examples, I think OpenStreetMap is a very interesting initiative. 1 million registered users who are contributing data that is from GPS devices or aerial photographs or other free-sourced map materials to OpenStreetMap, who then uploads all that data, incorporates it into their StreetMap software, and generates maps. The maps are actually openly licensed using Creative Commons, and the data is made available under an open data license. And the reason this is important is because if you look at something like Google Maps and look at the terms of use around Google Maps, it prohibits commercial use. It's all copyrighted to Google. The data is not, you can't use the Google Map data inside your own app. So if you're going to actually be entrepreneurial and create an app. So something like OpenStreetMap has really come along and sort of swept into the scene with an open source software initiative, open data, openly licensed maps, and allowing the end users, the public, to contribute to it, and also enabling entrepreneurs to have a source of maps that they can incorporate into their tools. And we recently at Creative Commons were interviewing the folks that are behind MuseScore. And MuseScore is a kind of musical score writing software application. But one of the things that they did was they ran a Kickstarter initiative to take the Bach Goldberg variations and using funding that they crowdsourced from the public to actually create a public domain score and a free, openly licensed professional studio recording quality of these songs that anyone would have access to and be able to download and play for free. If you haven't looked at MuseScore, their biggest market is education. They have two main things. One is a piece of software. It's open source software that you can download. It lets you create, edit, playback, and print musical scores. So any of you that are musicians oriented, this is an awesome way to get a free tool, open source software tool that you can use to create a score for the music that you're authoring. Then they also do this very interesting thing where they have a separate space, MuseScore.com, where they allow you to publish and share the scores that you've authored online. And you can say that they're completely copyright and someone has to contact you, or you can openly license them and share them that way. MuseScore is actually taking off in a really big way and becoming quite a phenomenon in the music space. They're running a new Kickstarter campaign right now for another piece of music, which they're actually going to produce not only a public domain music score for and a recording for, but also Braille versions of the music score. I also really liked this. One of the fun things about my work at Creative Commons right now is that we get to look at the initiatives around the world. We have got 74 affiliates distributed internationally, and our India affiliate's been really busy and active, and they brought to our attention the whole India Biodiversity portal. This is a portal that allows, again, the public or end users to submit, to contribute either species, maps, documents, observations that they've had about species in the biodiversity regions of India. And they actually track here in the bottom a kind of activity monitor. You can see who the top contributor is. You can view observation stats. So even if you don't, I mean, you could have taken a picture of a pileated woodpecker here in Vancouver if we had such a portal and contributed to this resource. You could also, if someone else has already put up a photo for it, you could also write up, if you wished, observations about that species' behavior, where it lives, where you saw it, what it eats, where it's where does it go, all those kinds of things. So this is an example of a kind of commons peer-based produced portal dealing with the biodiversity in India. I mentioned open design. I really encourage you to check out this book if you've never seen it before. This book is essentially looking at the whole design field from an open perspective. And I really like this diagram, and I know it's a bit difficult perhaps to see from the back. So let me just kind of go through this. This kind of maps out a shift that has happened in the design space. So starting on the far left, we have what they call the craft era. And in the craft era, you had the designer and the maker were kind of the same person. And they would come up with a design for something they needed. They'd go in their workshop, get their tools, and they'd make whatever the thing is that needed to be developed. And it could have quite a bit of variety, and the consumer then had a variety of choices that they could pick from, and often actually spoke to the craft maker about what they actually needed. Then we move into the middle where we're kind of in the industrial age, and here you have the designer who gives their design to a factory, and the factory mass produces zillions of copies of that thing all the same. And the consumer is essentially a passive consumer having no input into the design process or production process. And now we're entering into this new phase on the far right where you have the maker is a kind of co-designer with the consumer. And so we're moving into a phase where there's a kind of interactive digital design process that can produce personalized products. And by way of example, let me throw out a few examples. This is Open Desk. So if you go to opendesk.cc, you can find out about this. Essentially, this organization provides designs for furniture. And they're openly licensed designs. You can download the design. You can customize it. So let's say, you need a coffee table for your living room, but it can't be any bigger than 36 inches in diameter. You can but the base design is one for 48 inches. Well, you can sort of customize the design to make it fit your local space and your local needs. And then the design can then be printed out on essentially a CNC machine which cuts wood based on computerized instructions. So you download the design, you can customize it, you get it cut out, and they actually identify places here locally as well as around the world where you can get the CNC service. Cut it out, basically get a set of cut wood similar to what you would get from IKEA. But then you assemble it yourself. And all this has been openly licensed. And they even have a community wall where they encourage people who've done this to actually post pictures of the furniture that they've had made for their own home. A bit of a community around it. Here's another really great example. I actually played with this example for quite a while. This is a site called nervous.com with a dash between each of the letters of nervous. And what it lets you do is custom design your own jewelry. Starts out with a basic design for jewelry, presents that design to you in 3D, and then gives you a whole set of tools to control how big it is, what material it's made of, the ultimate design and shape and features of that piece of jewelry are totally under your control. And then you can actually even go ahead and purchase it if you end up with some design that you really like. All of these efforts to produce sort of customized designs that we can alter ourselves, we can get made ourselves, allow us to kind of move away from mass-produced into a more custom-designed and craft-like practice. Thingiverse, if you've never looked at Thingiverse, this is a website that is acting as a portal or a source for designs for three-dimensional objects that can be printed on a 3D printer. And I saw there was a talk, I think, yesterday on the 3D printer piece, which I wish I could have seen. So, I mean, you can get a design for the pumpkin just in time for Halloween, or I actually was looking at this one myself, a highly customized S-hook. So you're if you decide at home that you need an S-hook, our traditional practice would be, we go to the hardware store and we buy an S-hook. But what's actually starting to emerge as a practice within the open design field is the opportunity for us as end users to actually find a design of the S-hook, make that S-hook be as big or as small as we want, and then get an S-hook made for us. Sort of personalized manufacturing process. So when I look at all those examples in the free culture and design space, what I see is an empowerment of individuals to take over and be engaged with the practice of culture and design. And I keep coming back to education and asking myself, where are the comparable examples in education? Where do we see students actively engaged in their own education content? Why do we continually ask students to produce what David Wiley a few days ago called disposable assignments when they could be co-creating a global public good? I think the whole fact that we have thousands and thousands of students producing assignments that get thrown away after they receive their mark is a shame. It's like a waste. It's increasingly, in my view, something that we need to change. And I hope we can think about morphing education towards a commons-based peer production model that engages the students equally in the openness and open practices as we've engaged government and institutions and faculty, and maybe even more so. And the way that I see that happening, the way that I see the open practices and corresponding freedoms manifesting themselves is in pedagogy. And I can talk about the pedagogy examples if you want. But I want to just close with a couple of other high-level comments about openness in society writ large, and share with you a couple of other books that have been very interesting from a reading point of view in terms of this space. Our Commonwealth talks about openness and sharing and what might be thought of as the commons as something much bigger than what we typically think about it as being. So it talks about things like sidewalks, public squares, parks, even water as being a shared commons that we all are responsible for and engage with. And that some of the commons are certainly gifts of nature, and others are things that humans have produced, and that is something that it talks about as a hidden economy that actually ends up driving and making our more sort of visible economy work. And it explores the relationship between how we treat that hidden economy and how our society is currently functioning. The Wealth of the Commons, A World Beyond Market and State, also explores the commons in a very broad way, looking at the commons as a new paradigm, exploring how it's an alternative to the traditional enclosure of capitalism and all the resistance towards the commons that emerges from capitalism, and then looks at it as a major innovation and how it can be a method for enabling social change by creating knowledge, things like knowledge commons, and then talks about the whole policy and production framework, which I've also briefly explored. So I just thought I'd throw those out there. If you're interested in this whole openness space and the commons as a kind of broad concept, I encourage you to check out some of these books. I also encourage you to look at things like shareable.net, which looks at, so when we talk about openness and freedoms, we're really typically talking about sharing. And a space like shareable.net, a site like shareable.net, it really is providing, let me just go to it. This is actually fun. It's really kind of exploring all aspects of society from a sharing perspective. So sharing in terms of what's taking place in cities, in lifestyle, in enterprise, in the economy, in technology, the commons. And that's where you end up starting to learn about car sharing, or about new websites like Airbnb. If you've not looked at Airbnb.com, I encourage you to do that. It's essentially people sharing their homes, not in a couch surfing kind of way, but in a B&B kind of way, although without the breakfast part. And so you can get really affordable spaces in popular cities around the world through Airbnb. And this whole sort of sharing lifestyle or sharing idea has rapidly sort of spread throughout society. And when you have things like Airbnb and car sharing happening, where individuals are making their cars available or their homes available for others to rent, it's also raising some very interesting issues around how is that allowed, and do those organizations face similar taxation laws as regular businesses? And so there's some interesting stuff going on there in the shareable space. I think as well, and I'll just close with this actually, when I look at this larger, more expansive view of openness and sharing, you end up uncovering things like the city of Seoul in Korea, which is really facing huge problems in terms of environmental issues, overpopulation, pollution, waste, trying to deal with their problem by becoming a sharing city. And there's also even initiatives around creating a shareable you, which is really kind of taking the notions of shareability, kind of partly economics, partly this do-it-yourself kind of culture that we're seeing embodied in much of free culture and open design, and bringing and open education initiatives and bringing that to the campus to kind of create more value, less money, greater collaboration between people, departments, institutions, and the broader community. I threw all this up on SlideShare, so if you are interested in the slides, they're up there for you to download. And I'll just stop here and just say I wanted to kind of present this kind of big picture and to kind of push at sharing and openness in education as needing to move well beyond faculty and kind of policy statements from the institution into practice, and in particular into practice pedagogically with students. But please, fire away. I didn't speak about MOOCs. Decided to leave that totally off the table. But I'm happy to talk about that in this context as well. But if you have any questions or want to probe at anything I've said, please. Yeah, you've been lectured too. Where's the openness in that? All right.
Thank you. Just to throw something in, like the issue of plagiarism that is so, important in academic environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And plagiarism versus originality, and whether we think about individual versus collective when we think about how to avoid that plagiarism, and when everything is what can be said new and how we can be original in that sense, in terms of students and their work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, I think plagiarism is kind of overemphasized from my point of view. I actually think what we need to be encouraging is appropriate attribution. I'm actually all for, just grab all that stuff. If you think that someone else has created something that really is inherent to what you're trying to say in your student assignment, I mean, you ought to be able to reference it. You ought to be able to use it, properly cite it, of course, which is where the where we start to have issues with plagiarism. And even within the openness practices that I'm kind of engaged in now in education and beyond, there are lots of people who are not giving any citation at all for resources that they find, and so I find that plagiarism is as much practiced by faculty as students. Maybe how I'll put it that way. So when I look at faculty course materials now, I see tons of stuff in there. Images, diagrams, lots and lots of material that they just grabbed somewhere. They don't attribute it to wherever they grabbed it from. They just said, this is going to be great for my course, and they plunk it in there, and away they go. I actually don't see that as I see that as equally egregious as student plagiarism. Okay. No one's going to lynch me for that? I mean, I think that, for the concept that I've been pushing, which is sort of commons-based peer production, getting students involved in producing larger public works that are a global good. There have been examples here at UBC, the work that you did with Wikipedia work. I mean, that's an awesome example. I think that's very admirable and ought to be replicated more widely. And I think it's just one possibility. I think there are lots and lots of pedagogical ways that we can do this. So I look forward to seeing some more come out of UBC.
Great. Well, let me just say thanks to Paul for speaking on that very engaging topic, and if we could all just join in thanking him together.